Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the first chapter of the book of John. And John belongs to the New Testament genre of Gospels, which are not strictly speaking biographies. They do contain biographical elements, but a biography in the strictest sense of the word contains the full range of its protagonist's life, whereas the Gospels focus primarily, although not exclusively, on the 3-year ministry of its protagonist, who was the Messiah or Savior. But John is easily the most unique of all the Gospels, so much so that the other 3 are known as the Synoptic Gospels, which is semantically rooted in a Greek term for similarities of outlook. 92% of the material in John you're not going to find in any other Gospel. The closest competitor is Luke, which is 54. Then Matthew has 42, and Mark has 7% original material. And Mark contains very few of the actual words or sermons of the Savior. His is an action-oriented account, which begins with the ministry of the Savior right off the bat, whereas the account of Matthew begins with the infancy narrative, and Luke begins with the story of how John the Baptist's father, a priest by the name of Zacharias, was approached. But John begins with he emphasizes the divinity of the divine-human duality that was the Savior to perhaps a greater extent than all of the others. The concept of a pre-incarnate Messiah is arguably uniquely his, and his account begins in the councils of eternity, then abruptly transitions, like Mark, to the beginning of his ministry. And we may or may not have enough time to cover in that today, but without further ado, we're going to read the first verse, which reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim." Now, the Word we understand to be a title of the Savior. It is also an agent of creation. We read that the world was spoken into existence in Psalm 33, verses 6 and 9, and other places. And the Word was with Elohim means that he was Elohim. We understand to be what the Christians call the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. Each respective member has an equal claim to the title of Elohim. And the Word was with Elohim, so he was both with him and him, essentially. He was in the beginning with Elohim. Now, this has the same significance as Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. But this, we read that the Savior was a distinctive agent of creation. Now, in Genesis 1:26, we read the plurality of the pronouns us and ours, which implicitly connotate divine dialogue in a consultative collaboration in the creative process. But the Savior's presence, the Spirit himself, is distinctly mentioned in verse 2 as a distinctive agent of creation. But the Savior's presence himself is at best implicitly alluded to. But in the New Testament, which is the fuller revelation we know from verses such as Colossians 1:16, the verse we just mentioned, and Hebrews 1:2, that he was in fact involved in the creative process. All came to be through him, and without him not even one came to be that came to be. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Now, light is an intrinsically analogous element of divinity that John often employs. In First John, the first epistle of John, verse 1:5, he's identified as such. John 3:19, in the conversation of the Savior with Nicodemus, he says that men prefer the darkness to the light, and this reminds us of Plato's allegory of the cave. by which the one who lives in ignorance, analogous to darkness, is blinded by the light of coming into the unfamiliar territory of the light. And we're going to read that the world didn't recognize the one who created it eventually. And there was a man sent from Elohim whose name was John. Now this is not to be confused with the author of John of the epistle of the Gospel John, but John the Baptist, who was the forerunner. And his Hebrew name is Yohan, which is significant because in the Hebrew, names are of more than merely symbolic significance. So the Savior's real name, he's erroneously known as Jesus. That name was given to him by heretics. He was in fact known by his Hebrew contemporaries as Yahshua, which means Yah's salvation. And Yohan, who preceded him 6 months born in advance, his Hebrew name translates as Yah's grace, and this is significant because Yah's grace precedes Yah's salvation. This one came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all might believe through him. He was not that light, but that he might bear witness to that light. And this is not only John's mission, but our mission. We can never pretend to radiate the light that is uniquely his, but we can reflect it in our words, deeds, and actions by bearing witness to him. And our mission may not be to the unique extent in John, in that we come after the Messiah, but we still bear the same responsibility. Whether we heed to it or not is entirely up to us. But he was, this is a reference to the Savior, the true light, which enlightens every man coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came to be through him, and the world knew him not. And this is the tragedy, in that the very creator of the world, who in an act of supreme grace, known as the Incarnation, took up all the infirmities and frailties of the flesh to identify with the human condition, and was rejected and scorned by the very people he was sent to save. Now some did accept him and become saved by him, but the fact is that the majority did and still do reject him and do not even recognize him for who he is and what he can do. But as many as received him, to them he gave the authority to become children of Elohim, to those believing in his name. Now, adoption is the single greatest blessing that the saints have. We're adopted into the family of the faith, through which we may have eternal fellowship in the heavenly presence of the Father, through the merits of the bitter passion. Who were born not of blood, nor of the desire of the flesh, nor of the desire of man, but of Elohim. And the Word became flesh, and pitched his tent among us, and we saw his esteem as of an only begotten of a Father, complete in grace and truth. Now there's a lot to digest in this verse. This is what is known as the incarnation, by which the Word, which we already identified as a divine title or entity, became flesh. So divinity, other religions have absolute impossibility to reconcile this, the possibility that divinity can somehow inhabit a human frame and flesh. But it was made possible through an act of supreme grace, and he pitched his tent among us. That means he walked among us. He worked. He went through the essential experiences of life. He lived the first 30 years of his life in quiet anonymity, in preparation of his 3-year ministry, which ultimately culminated on the cross. He brought grace and truth. Now, grace is a divine favor. It's a theological term which translates as that, and truth. And he is identified as the personification of truth in John 14:6 and in other places. John bore witness of him, that being John the Baptist, and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me has become before me, because he was before me. Now this is, biologically speaking, John was born 6 months in advance of the Savior, yet the Savior had a pre-incarnate existence. In other words, he was born since the councils of eternity. So that explains the dichotomy, and it ceases to be a dichotomy once this is properly understood. So it was entirely possible for him to come after him biologically, yet come before him, being as old as eternity itself, being born in the councils of eternity. And out of his completeness we all received, and grace upon grace. For the Torah was given through Moses, the grace and the truth came through Yahshua Messiah. And this is what is known as the fifth dispensation. You can type in Corey Johnston, Exodus 21 through 5 for more information on that. The fifth dispensation was known as the dispensation of law, which came through Moses, to whom we are also indebted to for our source of information on the 4 preceding dispensations, which would otherwise be lost. But the dispensation of grace was ultimately came through the Messiah. He's the author and originator and the source of our salvation. Now, the law's purpose is to expose and convict sin, and this can lead us to salvation, but it can lead us to the one who can save us from our sin. But in it itself, it cannot save us. No one has ever seen Yahweh, the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he declared. Now, Yahweh is invisible and incorporeal and of no tangible material, but the fullest expression of his essence in physical form came through his Son, who in fact assumed physical form. And a verse that comes to mind, there's plenty of allusions to this, Exodus 33:20, Deuteronomy 4:12, but 1 John 4:12 says that the visible manifestations of the invisible Creator is made visible through our acts of love, because he and love are synonymously interchangeable. So when we love each other and show the love that originates and is comes from the Father, that's when we make visible the invisible Creator. It is through acts of love, which is the ultimate meaning and manifestation of religion. Now this was the witness of John when the Jews sent from Jerusalem priests and Levites to ask him, "Who are you?" And he confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." Now there was a source of confusion rooted in, because the prophetic word had ceased until it came to his father, Zacharias. There had been a 400-year lapse in which the prophetic word had ceased from Israel. So because he was on the receiving end of what is known as divine revelation, many confused him as the Messiah, but he refuted that claim and told them that he was not him, but he was his purpose in existence was to point to him. And they asked him, "Who then are you, Elijah?" And he said, "I am not. Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." Therefore they said to them, "Who are you, so that we may give an answer to those who sent us? What say you about yourself?" He said, "I am a voice crying in the wilderness, make straight the ways of Yahweh, as the prophet Isaiah said." Now this is an allusion to Isaiah 43, which is a prophetic premonition of the one known as John, who would point the way to the Messiah. And the priests were sent at the behest of their superiors to investigate, because the entire priestly task revolved around identifying the Messiah, to whom they supposedly were awaiting, yet denied when they came. And John didn't dignify their claim. He didn't pretend to be the one that others thought that some thought he was, but he pointed to the one who was. And as we read, tragically, he was rejected and refused by the majority of the Sanhedrin. There were, of course, exceptions, but this is something worth picking up on the next time. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Tune in next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.